Hey guys, Shines here. I'm really excited about this one. I have been wanting to talk about this synthesizer since I started this channel. This is the Mother-32. It's made by Moog in Asheville, North Carolina, and it's a semi-modular analog synthesizer. There's a lot of reviews and demos of the synthesizer out there, and so many of them concentrate on the sound design capabilities of this synth. So I'm going to do something a little different, and I'm going to start with the sequencer, because I think that's what makes this synth truly unique. I actually do have a tutorial on sound design coming up, so stick around and maybe subscribe if you want to be one of the first to know when that drops. We'll concentrate mostly on the keyboard and sequencer control buttons here. We're also going to touch upon these 4 patch points and how we can use them to mess around with a running sequence. The buttons are laid out similar to 1 octave of keys on a piano. This goes hand in hand with Bob Moog's original approach to making his synthesizers more friendly to people who already had experience with musical instruments like a piano. The keyboard buttons, along with these 2 arrow keys and this LED strip, will let you play notes in an 8-octave range, which is actually 1 octave more than a professional grand piano. Getting used to playing these little buttons is going to make sequencing a little bit easier for you. The keyboard buttons, along with these buttons to the left, are going to be the main interface for the sequencer. Notice that the keyboard buttons have numbers from 1 through 8, and above that, what would be the black keys on a piano have numbers in groups of 8. That's because these buttons double as your sequence steps, and these are your sequence pages. Mother-32, as its name suggests, plays 32-step sequences. And this is how each sequence is shown. If I make a sequence with 32 steps in it, these page buttons will take me to each 8-note group within my sequence. It's interesting to me how they went with 32 steps instead of the 16 you see in Korg's Minilog XD, or 64 steps like you see in Moog's higher-end synths like the Sub-37. There is a lot you can do with 32 steps. You can do a 4-chord progression, played in 8-note arpeggios, 2 16-step beat patterns that cycle back and forth between each other, or seemingly endless ambient drones that just morph over time. And you can store up to 64 of these on this synth, and they're stored here. If I hold the Shift and Pattern button down, I can now choose one of the 8 banks. And then I'll hold the Pattern button down to select a sequence within that bank. I get 8 sequences per bank, and I get 8 banks. By default, all sequences are going to play a single note, like so. We'll start here. By default, you'll be in keyboard mode as opposed to step mode. In keyboard mode, you're going to input your notes using the built-in keyboard. So we're going to hold Shift and this Run/Stop button, which you can see is record mode. Notice how the first step blinks, and then as I plug in notes, each subsequent step will blink afterwards. Use this Hold/Rest button to input rests within your sequence. When you're done, hit Run/Stop to stop, and then hit Run to replay your sequence. While you're in keyboard mode, you can transpose the sequence during playback, which is useful for running bass lines, or changing the key of your sequence mid-track if you're weird like me. You need to save your sequence into one of the 8 slots available in one of the 8 banks. I don't want to save this sequence, so I'll simply hold Shift and Run to record over the steps I put in before. If you want to delete your sequence, hold the Shift button, hold down the Reset button, and press Pattern. That'll initialize your pattern back to the default. You can end your sequence at any length you want, and it'll only play back those notes. So if you want a weird 19-step sequence, you can do that. This is not really going to go with any sort of beat pattern that we can recognize. This will sound nice and weird. So let's save the sequence by holding down the same 2 buttons we used to start recording. Shift and Run/Stop. We're just going to hold these buttons down, and you'll notice the LED lights will show you which slot our sequence is now going to be stored in. While the green LED is blinking, you can hold Shift and press Bank, and then choose the bank you want the sequence to be stored in. And then we're going to hit Shift and Run, and then you're going to see this green LED flash, letting you know that the sequence is now saved. Now I have this weird 19-step sequence. I'd rather it be a 16-step sequence, so let's head into step mode and do some editing. It's going to show us all of the notes that we've entered, and this is where those sequence page numbers are going to come into use. Here are the steps 1 through 8. I can turn some into rests if I want here. So I'm going to hop over to notes 9 through 16, and now notes 17 through 24. Here I can see those 3 additional notes that I plugged in to make this a 19-step sequence. If I want this sequence to end on step 16, I'm going to go back to this 9 through 16 page, hold the Set End button, and choose the last note here. Now it's a 16-step sequence. Now, there's a bunch of other things you can do to edit your sequence while we're in step mode, and most of this is done on a per note basis. Let's say you want to change a specific note or its length. So this is how that's done. You're going to hold Shift and then select an individual note. You'll see that note start to blink. And now if I play a new note, I've just replaced that note with the new one. This is useful when you accidentally plug in the wrong note during a super long sequence that you're writing, and you don't want to have to redo the entire thing. You just want to go back later and fix that one note. While the note is selected, you can add accents using this accent button, and an accent will just make that note slightly more emphasized or a little louder than the other notes. You can add a slide, or my personal favorite, the ratchet. This is actually a really good one for fast-paced rhythmic sequences. So now that we've inputted our sequences and edited them to perfection, let's start performing with them and messing with them. The sequencer has 4 different playback modes, and you change them by holding down the 2 arrow keys and then selecting the buttons from 1 through 4. 1 I would consider to be normal, it just plays your sequence forward. 2 will play your sequence in reverse. 3 is called pendulum, which will play your sequence till the end and then play your sequence back to the beginning. So if you're trying to make palindromic sequences, is that a word, palindromic? You can do that with this mode. Now my favorite mode is the 4th, which is random. It's absolutely amazing when it comes to generative stuff, and when we talk about patching in another video, we'll talk about this more. Here's some things that you can do while your sequence is playing. First of which is pattern switching. While playing, you can choose the next pattern to play, and then once the sequence reaches the end, it will jump to the next pattern. Your sequences can then flow from one into another and back, and you can use it for song building and really fun stuff like that. You can also do live accents and live ratchets, so while your sequence is playing, you can hold the Shift key down and use the glide knob to add ratchets. You can use this accent button whenever you want, and it'll punch out those individual notes. Okay, so those are the buttons for the sequencer. Let's talk about some patching. There's 32 patch points on the Mother-32, and the last 4 are almost dedicated to sequencing. Playing around with the tempo patch point can be a ton of fun if you want a sequence to run off tempo, almost like computer chatter. I like to take my LFO and patch it into tempo so my sequence plays completely off beat and sounds sort of like computer chatter, especially when in random mode. The run/stop patch point will let you start and stop your sequence based on input from other areas of the synth. Same with reset. You can have your sequence reset back to the first note, depending on, let's say, how high the note is. Again, this is really cool for randomized sequences. You never know when that sequence is going to just jump back to the beginning. And this last one, hold, is so that you can have your sequence hold a single note depending on modulation, again, from somewhere else on the synth. Okay, bonus tip, there is a patch point on the synth called assignable. This is by far the most versatile patch point on the synth. Depending on the setting, this patch point will be one of 16 different outputs. That sounds like a lot, but most of them are actually for MIDI messages. The real interesting ones are the ones involving sequencer clock division and accenting. We need to hold Shift, Reset, Set End, and 8 to get into setup mode for this assignable output. And by default, you'll be on page 1 of all of the different outputs that you can assign. We're gonna work mostly in page 1, because that is where you can determine the assignable output. The others are for MIDI channel and tempo input settings. My favorite output mode is actually the first output mode, which is called accent. So any note that you have an accent on is going to trigger the output of this patch point. There's also sequencer clock divided by 2, and then sequencer clock divided by 4. So depending on when you want stuff to happen during your sequence, you can set up accents, you can set up different sequence clock modes. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. So that's it for the onboard stuff. Now, you can also externally sequence the Mother-32 using the built-in MIDI port or the gate and CV input patch points on the synth. If you're feeling limited by the 32 steps in the built-in sequencer, this might make a big difference for you. Now, there's a lot more to talk about with the synthesizer, and like I said before, I do have a full tutorial on patching and sound design on this synth. So if you're like me and you own one of these amazing instruments, I want to help you get the most out of it as possible. It is so much fun learning about stuff to then teach to you guys, and honestly, if I could do this for a living, I would. On that note, let me know down in the comments if you think there's something I missed about the sequencer that you think is really cool, and I just want to say thank you so much for joining. We'll catch you in the next one.